Do you think that orchids can't walk? If you're an orchid lover, you've probably noticed when your orchid begins to grow intensively out of the pot, starts to flip over the edge, and doesn't stay where you plant it. Why are orchids running out of the pot, and what does this mean? How is it possible for orchids to move themselves out of your pot? It's just a plant. Plants can't move. Oh yes, they can. We've explained before in a previous video why epiphytic orchids don't need containers or substrate. They need a host to attach themselves to. Aerial orchid roots can provide all nutrients and absorb moisture just freely hanging in the air. Orchid roots are photosynthetic and have a unique velamen layer with its own symbiotic nitrogen fixating microbiota. So, what are the reasons behind orchids not being firmly attached to your pot or the host, and how do they manage to move out of these unwanted conditions? There are a few different mechanisms which allow them to do so, one of which being phototropism. Phototropism is the ability of a plant to reorient the shoot growth towards a direction of a light source. Phototropism is important for orchids as it enhances the ability of the plants to optimize their photosynthetic capacity. All forms of tropism is a response or orientation of an orchid plant to a stimulus that acts with greater intensity from one direction than another. It may be achieved by active movement or by structural alteration. Forms of tropism besides phototropism include geotropism, which is a response to gravity, chemotropism, a response to particular substances, hydrotropism, a response to water, thigmotropism, a response to mechanical stimulation, traumatotropism, a response to wounds, and galvanotropism or electrotropism, which is a response to electric currents. Tropisms can be distinguished according to the orientation with respect to the direction of the stimulus. They can commonly be either positive, which is towards the stimulus, or negative, away from the stimulus. If your orchid plant is intensively trying to grow out of your pot, especially if it grows in one direction, we can assume that something isn't right with the current conditions. We have to analyze and change it by improving one of the following conditions: the light, the moisture, temperature, nutrients, or mechanical irritation. But besides all forms of tropism being activated by plant hormones like auxin and phototropin, orchids have unique abilities to attach themselves to different surfaces: tree bark, stones, plastic, or even glass. Healthy orchids are simply able to remove themselves from unwanted locations and try to find more appropriate favorable conditions by means of these tropisms or these attachment mechanisms. For vascular epiphytic orchids, strong attachment to the host surface is very important for survival. Aerial orchid roots do not penetrate the host tissues, but instead they achieve attachment by growing in close contact to the surface of the substrate. However, very little is known about the attachment functions of epiphytic roots in comparison to attachment strategies of climber plants. Up to this date, research data remains scarce. Scientists' use of histology and microscopy found that the underside of the orchid root, upon contact with the substrate surface, becomes flat, and the velamen layer appears to behave like a soft foam, closely following the contours of the substrate. Then, root hairs emerged from the outermost velamen layer and entered into the crevices in the substrate. Whenever possible, a layer of amorphous substance, a glue-like substance, was observed on the surface of the root hairs, and researchers hypothesized that epiphytic orchid roots produced a layer of glue-like substances that adhere the root to the substrate. This further generates a mechanical interlocking mechanism between the root and the substrate and reinforces the attachment of the root and hence the whole plant to the substrate. However, orchids won't attach themselves to bark, pot, or other surfaces in unfavorable conditions. No matter what you do, it will try to grow out of the pot to find a better location, using these tropism mechanisms. And what do we normally do in this case? Well, the first step would be to change your pot for a bigger one, but that might not always be helpful. If the healthy orchid didn't attach itself to the previous container, it's probably not going to do it again to a newer one. Larger pots can also promote other problems like overwatering, and that can only cause further problems like crown rot and so on. So instead, we have to focus on what's causing your orchid to move. Maybe your orchid needs to be in a brighter spot. Maybe you need to increase the humidity or the temperature. Avoid locations where your orchid is disturbed very often. And I can assure you, when your orchid finds a spot where it prefers to grow forever, it will permanently attach itself to all possible surfaces around. Like this one attached itself to the windowsill, so it's impossible to remove it now without damaging the roots. Thank you so much for watching.